Hello and welcome back. In the first part of this series, we analyzed the 4 canonical Gospels and their accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. We found that the Gospels contradict one another on several important points. I conclude that while they may contain some historical truths, these books are not historically reliable. Today I want to look at a few popular arguments on the resurrection. Some apologists, rather than arguing about every little point in the Gospels, take a so-called minimal facts approach. That is, they focus on just a few bullet points to support a case for the resurrection. For instance, they might make their case as follows. Jesus died by crucifixion. Days later, his tomb was found empty. People reported seeing him alive afterward, and his followers were so confident in his resurrection that they were willing to risk persecution or death. It's true that if these basic points are correct, it may not matter which women went to the tomb or how many angels they saw. So it makes sense in a way to look at the big picture rather than getting lost in the details. On the other hand, contradictions in the gospel stories speak to the reliability of those accounts. If the Gospels aren't reliable, why should we believe any of this stuff? Let's take these points one by one. Jesus died by crucifixion. It isn't really clear why this is part of the argument. I mean, the fact that he died isn't evidence that he came back to life. And it doesn't really make any difference that he died by crucifixion. If he did rise from the dead, he presumably could have done it no matter how he died. For what it's worth, the evidence for this point isn't quite what the apologists think it is. The oldest documents claiming Jesus was crucified are the books of the New Testament. So again, it depends on whether the Bible is historically reliable. There are some extra-biblical sources that repeat the claim, but these are all later than the Gospels. There's some question as to whether the passage in Josephus is authentic, but even if we assume it is, there's no reason to believe that Tacitus and Josephus independently verified these facts. It's much more likely that they were just passing along the story that was in circulation. I'm willing to grant, for the sake of argument, that Jesus lived, he had a ministry, and he was crucified. These are relatively mundane claims. There were plenty of itinerant preachers in Judea at that time. Jesus was a fairly common name, and lots of people were crucified under Pilate. But none of this evidence is anywhere approaching the realm of historical proof. The empty tomb, again, is not an established fact. It's a claim made in the Bible. There's no evidence for it outside the Gospels. As I've mentioned, there's no real evidence that Jesus was buried in a tomb at all. It was not usual for crucified criminals to receive a proper burial. More often, their bodies would be thrown into mass graves or otherwise discarded. The Gospels say that Joseph of Arimathea got special permission from Pilate to bury Jesus. Mark, Luke, and John say that Joseph buried him in a tomb, without specifying who it belonged to. Maybe people were wondering whose tomb it was, because Matthew adds in a detail that it was Joseph's own tomb. So maybe that's what happened. It's not impossible, but it's not at all an established fact. Some apologists argue that the story in the Gospels where the women discover the empty tomb is credible based on a principle they call the Criterion of Embarrassment. They point out that Mary Magdalene, and whoever went to the tomb with her, were the first ones to see the empty tomb. But in the ancient world, and particularly in Jewish law, women were not allowed to testify as witnesses in court. They conclude that it would be embarrassing for the gospel writers to admit that their stories depended on the testimony of women. And that shows they're telling the truth, because if they were going to make something up, they'd choose the men to be the first witnesses. This is an awful argument for so many reasons. First of all, the Gospels say that the women went to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus. This job of anointing a body for burial was considered women's work. If anyone was going to go and visit the body, it would most likely be women, and the Gospel's original audience knew that. So it makes no sense to suggest that the authors could have chosen the men to do it, not if their aim was to make the story sound plausible. Second of all, there's no actual evidence that the ancient writers would consider this embarrassing. While it's true there were certain prohibitions against women testifying in court, there's evidence that there were exceptions to the rule. According to a historical survey published by Hebrew Union College, a woman's testimony would be admissible if she told her story right away, as the women do in the Gospels. In any case, rules about what's admissible in court are a separate issue from what's considered believable in everyday life. Women could tell people what they saw, whether it would be allowed in court or not, and there's no evidence that this was seen as a problem. The burden is on the apologist to show that this would have been considered embarrassing. Third of all, women have a prominent role throughout the Gospels. Part of the Gospel's message is that marginalized people like lepers, prostitutes, poor people, Samaritans, and women are worthy to be included in this movement. So if it seems like these accounts are emphasizing the role of women, that's consistent with what we know about the author's purpose. Finally, and most importantly, nothing in the story actually depends on the testimony of women. Yes, they are the first ones to visit the tomb, but you're not supposed to believe just because the women said so. The whole point is that they need to go and tell the men. In some versions of the story, the women are not believed. In Luke and John, the men go and see for themselves. They verify that the tomb is empty. And then, in all four Gospels, Jesus appears to the men. If the Gospel authors were at all anxious about relying on the testimony of women, they had absolutely nothing to worry about. Apologists also point to this passage in Matthew, in which the Jewish priests spread a rumor that the body was stolen. The idea here is that the Gospel writer would only mention this if it was a real rumor circulating among critics. After all, why would the author bring up the idea of a stolen body unless he was answering a real objection? So the argument is that the critics, by proposing the body was stolen, tacitly acknowledged that the tomb was empty. This argument falls apart under the slightest scrutiny. Remember that Matthew's Gospel was written some 50 years after the event. The author acknowledges that time has passed when he says the story is still circulating to this very day. At this point, there would have been no way of knowing if there was an empty tomb or not. If you pointed to a tomb that was empty, how would you go about demonstrating it was the tomb of Jesus? You couldn't. So why would critics seem to grant that the tomb of Jesus was found empty? We can only speculate, but it seems reasonable that they would grant this for the sake of argument. They would essentially be saying, even if the tomb was empty, it doesn't prove a resurrection. The body could have been stolen. It doesn't mean they were convinced of an empty tomb. What it shows is that they didn't feel the need to argue over such a trivial point. To take a simple analogy, if someone told you she had a cookie jar and claimed the cookies inside it had magically disappeared, you might suggest, well, maybe it wasn't magic. Maybe her little sister ate the cookies. That doesn't imply you've verified that the cookie jar is empty. Maybe the cookie jar is full. Maybe it never had cookies in it at all. Maybe there is no cookie jar. All you're saying is that if there's a cookie jar, and if it's empty, there might be a naturalistic explanation. It's possible that Jesus had a tomb. It's possible women went to visit, and it's possible that for some reason they found the tomb empty. But these are mere possibilities, claims in the Bible. They are not established facts. The next claim is that after Jesus' death, people reported seeing him alive. Once again, the credibility of this claim depends almost entirely on whether the Gospels are historically reliable. Let me repeat once more that the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts. They were written down after decades of stories being passed from one person to the next, ever changing, and as we have seen, they are full of contradictions. The only first-person account from someone claiming to have seen Jesus is in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Note that Paul was not one of the original disciples. Paul started out as Saul, a Pharisee from Tarsus, which is a city in Asia Minor or modern-day Turkey. According to the Bible, he started out as a persecutor of Christians, and then he had an experience of Christ on the road to Damascus, converted to Christianity, changed his name to Paul, and became one of the leaders of the movement. As far as we know, Paul never met Jesus during Jesus' life and ministry. His only encounter with Jesus would have been post-resurrection, on the road to Damascus. So in 1 Corinthians, Paul says that Jesus appeared first to Cephas, which is another name for Peter, then to the 12. Then Paul says he appeared to more than 500 people at the same time, then to James and all the apostles, and finally to Paul himself. It's interesting that Paul mentions an appearance to Peter, because Luke mentioned this too, but that appearance is not described in any of the Gospels. Then Paul mentions the 12, which would really be 11 because of Judas, but we'll let that slide. Notice Paul doesn't say anything about Mary Magdalene or the other women, and he doesn't mention a tomb. Then there's this claim that Jesus appeared to more than 500 people. This is strange, because there's nothing like that in any of the Gospels. If the resurrected Christ had done a big event with 500 people in attendance, don't you think one of the 4 Gospel writers would have mentioned it? I've seen apologists present this as if it's their strongest piece of evidence. Like, maybe a dozen people could be fooled or lying, but how are you going to fool 500 people? In reality, this isn't evidence at all. It's simply a claim, and there are absolutely no details. Who are these 500 people? What are their names? And what was the nature of this event? How did Jesus address 500 people at once? Was it in a big field, or on a mountain, or in an amphitheater? Peter and James, at least, were sort of public figures. We know their names. There's at least some evidence that they really existed. But we know nothing about these 500 brothers and sisters. Paul could have said any number. He could have said 1,000,000. When Paul references James, that's understood to mean James, the brother of Jesus, not the disciple James, son of Zebedee. This would be another appearance not included in the Gospels. Next, all the apostles. It's not clear who is meant here. Sometimes the 12 disciples are called the apostles, but we have already mentioned the 12. So it's hard to say who else counts as an apostle according to Paul. And finally, Paul includes himself. This is interesting because the appearance to Paul is not quite the same as the appearances in the Gospels. The story of Paul's experience is told in Acts, chapter 9, and again in chapter 22. In this story, Paul never actually sees Jesus. He sees a bright light from heaven, and he hears a voice, but there's no bodily appearance. This is nothing like the appearances in the Gospels, where Jesus appears physically, in person, sits with the disciples, and shares a meal with them. This is more like some type of mystical experience. Note that Paul's companions don't understand what the voice is saying. Only Paul hears the voice say, "I am Jesus." It's a private experience that the others do not share. He falls to the ground, he hears a voice, and he temporarily loses his sight. Some commentators have suggested Paul is having some kind of seizure or a psychotic break. But even if we grant that it was a genuine mystical experience, this is not a physical appearance of the resurrected Lord. Okay, so this is different from the appearances in the Gospels. Why does that matter? Well, this is our only clue as to what Paul means when he talks about a resurrection appearance. When he says Jesus appeared to 500 people, does he mean a physical, bodily appearance? Or does he mean they saw a bright light, or heard a sound, or felt a feeling? When Paul says Jesus appeared to Peter and James and the other apostles, does that mean Jesus came to them in person? Or does it mean they had some kind of dream or vision? I'm not denying that Paul believed in a physical bodily resurrection. We know from his other writings that he did. The question is what he's counting as evidence. And there's no reason to assume he's talking about the kind of physical appearances described in the Gospels. There were no Gospels when Paul wrote the letter to the Corinthians. These vague claims came first. The Gospel stories were written later. So now we come to the final step in the argument. The followers of Jesus demonstrated their truthfulness by giving up their lives for the sake of their beliefs. To investigate this claim, we need to dig into some specifics. Who died? What message were they preaching? And was this the reason they were killed? Once we have some facts to look at, we can talk about what these facts actually prove. Church tradition teaches that 10 of the original 12 disciples died as martyrs, all except Judas and John. But most of these stories are easily dismissed as medieval legends. Even if we trust the Bible and the early Christian historians, there's no reason to believe Simon the Zealot was sawed in half, or that Bartholomew was skinned alive and beheaded. Secular and Christian historians agree there's no reliable basis for these stories. If we limit ourselves to apostles whose deaths are attested in ancient sources, there are 4 who allegedly witnessed the resurrected Christ: James the son of Zebedee, James the brother of Jesus, Peter, and Paul. James, son of Zebedee's death is recorded in Acts of the Apostles. The death of James, the brother of Jesus, is actually reported in a non-Christian source, the Jewish historian Josephus. The martyrdom of Peter and Paul is first mentioned by Clement of Rome in a letter from late in the 1st century. After that, it ends up in histories of the early church by writers like Eusebius. Let's grant for the sake of argument that these accounts are accurate and these men were killed in the ways described. What were they saying, and is that why they were killed? As far as what they were preaching, I am sure they promoted certain claims about the nature of God and salvation in Christ. But if the argument is that they died for their faith in the resurrection of Jesus, our question is, what were they proclaiming specifically about the resurrection? Again, the only person who tells us he encountered the resurrected Jesus is Paul, who only heard a voice. There are letters in the New Testament attributed to Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, but scholars tend to doubt they were really written by Peter and James. For one thing, as I mentioned at the beginning of this series, it's unlikely that the apostles would have been able to write in their own native language, let alone in Greek. But even if we take these letters to be authentic, they do not repeat the specific claims we see in the Gospels. The authors do not personally testify to having seen Jesus after he died. And why were these men killed? The 2 Jameses were apparently condemned by the Jewish authorities. James, the brother of Jesus, was labeled a lawbreaker, and he was stoned to death, which can be the punishment for blasphemy. But there's no evidence that they were targeted specifically for preaching the resurrection. The early Christians apparently did lots of things that the Jewish authorities would have considered violations of law. According to the Gospels, they were working on the Sabbath, violating Jewish dietary laws, and claiming the authority to forgive sins. The Gospels also use some harsh anti-Jewish rhetoric, addressing Jewish leaders as snakes, vipers, and children of the devil, and saying they're condemned to hell. In Acts chapters 6 and 7, a Christian named Stephen is brought before the Sanhedrin and charged with blasphemy, just like James, the brother of Jesus. Stephen lashes out at the council, accusing them of killing Christ. If James, son of Zebedee, and James, the brother of Jesus, were using that type of language, it's not surprising that they were accused of blasphemy. I am not saying they deserved what they got. No one should be persecuted for their religious beliefs. The point is, there's no reason to assume that their belief in the resurrection was the issue here. Peter and Paul were killed in Rome under Emperor Nero. Tacitus tells us that Nero's persecution of Christians began in the summer of 64, when he blamed them for causing the Great Fire of Rome. Roman emperors hated Christians for a number of reasons, including the fact that they refused to make sacrifices to the traditional Roman gods or to worship the emperor himself as a deity. But it should be obvious that the Romans didn't care about them preaching the resurrection. Why would Nero care whether some Jew had risen from the grave? So there's no real evidence that the early Christians were targeted specifically for believing in the resurrection. Still, they were persecuted for being Christians, and they went on being Christians despite the risk of being tortured and killed. This suggests that whatever they believed it sincerely. It wasn't a hoax. Something must have convinced them that Christ was real, that despite the crucifixion, Jesus was somehow undefeated, that the cause of Christianity was one worth dying for. Yes, something convinced them of this. The question is, what? We can't assume that their experiences matched the specific claims made in the Gospels. These men died before the Gospels were written. We know that Paul never saw Jesus. He heard a voice. Maybe Peter and James had similar experiences. A voice, a vision, or Jesus came to them in a dream. There's no evidence that they saw him in person, sat down with him, and ate fish together, as the Gospels claim. Now, we should acknowledge that even if they were only mystic visions or prophetic dreams, these experiences were important enough to turn these men's lives around and make them brave in the face of danger. I don't deny that. To explain that, we'd have to get into the nature of religious experience. Let it suffice to say that this sort of thing is not unique to Christianity. Contemporaries of the Prophet Muhammad claimed to have seen miracles performed by the Prophet, and they were prepared to die for their beliefs. Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris swore they saw the angel Moroni deliver the golden plates that Joseph Smith used to translate the Book of Mormon, and to their dying day they maintained the story was true, even after their prophet was lynched by a mob in an Illinois jailhouse. Religious belief is an incredibly powerful force that can motivate people to do all sorts of things. But the intensity of their beliefs does nothing to prove the factual claims made by their religions. To summarize, I find that none of the so-called minimal facts is firmly established by evidence. There's some extra-biblical evidence for the crucifixion, but these sources are late, and they seem to be just repeating the stories that are in circulation. There's no evidence for the empty tomb outside the Gospels, and the arguments based on the Criterion of Embarrassment and the stolen body theory are not logically sound. The resurrection appearances are not backed up by eyewitness testimony. Our only first-person source is Paul, who heard a voice but did not see Jesus. The stories of the early Christian martyrs are greatly exaggerated. It is not clear that anyone was targeted specifically for proclaiming the resurrection, and this phenomenon of true believers dying for their faith is hardly unique to Christianity. That's it for part 2. Please let me know what you think in the comments. I hope you'll join me for the final episode of this series, in which I will consider what really happened.